Good evening, Facebook friends and everyone out there in the broader universe. This is Ajamu Baraka coming to you once again, a voice from the margins. It's been a few weeks, been involved in a lot of activities. I had to get on the road, was in places where I couldn't really have access to a very good signal. So I missed you for a few weeks, but now we are back. And over these last few weeks, a lot of things have been happening. So we have a lot of stuff to talk about. We had the Trump and the Russian stuff intensifying. We had the call for a 10% increase in the military budget. We had the introduction of Trump's budget proposal. A lot of very, very important things to talk about. A lot of very important activities. But tonight, we're going to just break off one piece of that and have I think, a very important conversation with a very important guest that we have with us tonight, Brother Jonathan Hutto, who is a longtime organizer, a human rights defender, who's been in the trenches, someone who did something very interesting for me and for many people. He is a anti-war activist, but he was an anti-war activist even as a member of the U.S. military, in the Navy specifically. And I can relate to that myself because, as many of you know, I'm a vet, and I was also a anti-war activist and organizer in the Army, right toward the tail end of the Vietnam adventure. And like Brother Jonathan, I organized, and it's a very interesting experience being an organizer in the military. So we're going to talk with Brother Jonathan, who captured a lot of his experiences in a book that you all need to check out. It's called Anti-War Soldier. That came out from Nations Books in 2008. So without any further ado, Brother Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us here tonight here on this Voice from the Margins.
Well, thank you, Ajamu, for having me. And just thank you for being a consistent and persistent organizer yourself and being an inspiration for my generation. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate that, brother. So look, let's go right into it because, I think a lot of people want to hear about, how you get into the kind of work that you were involved in particular, being an anti-war activist in the military. So talk a little bit about that experience and what motivated you.
It's interesting, Ajamu, as I'm coming up on 40 years, I'll be 40 years old, 40 years young, rather, next month. And so some of those dictums that I heard in my youth, particularly from one of your comrades, the late Kwame Ture, that the more you struggle, the more you know. It was in the early 2000s, organizing on the ground here in Prince George's County, Maryland, where I live, within a coalition of activists against police brutality, that I came across veteran organizers who had been involved in a movement that I knew nothing of called the GI movement. And so when we would be organizing and meeting at people's houses and whatnot, of course, I'm checking out literature that people have, books they have, and I'm delving into history that I knew nothing about. And so one of those books I came across was called Soldiers in Revolt. This was around like 2001 and 2002 timeframes. At that time, I wasn't seeing myself going into the military, but as conditions can change very quickly, and as the needs of a person can shift, particularly a person like myself, who, while I'm working for an NGO at that time, Amnesty International, I certainly didn't come from a privileged background. And so I found myself in 2004 taking enlistment within the United States Navy, thinking it would be a brief sojourn to pay off some student loans and access a graduate education, and found myself in the midst of battle within my chain of command, and actually began to draw upon those resources, those human resources, and also that theoretical knowledge that I came across on the ground while engaged in anti-racist struggle.
Mm-hmm. So what was the reaction from the chain of command to a young man, a brother, who started to raise questions about the role of the military and your specific participation.
You know, it actually it's interesting, Ajamu, because the struggle in my shop, I was stationed on the USS Theodore Roosevelt. That's one of the 12 aircraft carriers that they have in the United States Navy. I was a photographer's mate that then became a mass communication specialist. So I wrote articles, I shot video and pictures and whatnot. But in my shop, there was entrenched racism, entrenched xenophobia, and my resisting it was such a culture shock. In fact, at one point, I had gone AWOL in response to some harsh disciplinary procedures. But one of the people I was mentioning to you, who's a professor at Howard University, but also a veteran of the GI movement, struggled with me to go back to the ship and to fight and struggle, he said, in order to create the kind of condition that we can on the ship for democracy to be waged. So he struggled with me to do that. And so I went back, I struggled, and while we was off the coast of Iraq, February of 2006, we're off the coast of Iraq, launching planes, dropping bombs. But in the midst of that, some white petty officers, a couple of white petty officers, I don't want to say, because I want to stress it that way, because not all the whites were like this, but there were some that were just overtly racist, put a hangman's noose in front of my face. And it was at that point that we took the struggle to equal opportunity. And by the time, so we was able to get a small victory out of that. The perpetrator was reduced in rank, what have you. But it was out of that struggle that I then made contact with David Courtwright, who was the author of Soldiers in Revolt, which chronicles the GI movement. We brought him to Norfolk, Virginia in the spring of '06 when our ship got back in port. And then some discussions took place that summer where we began to craft what became the appeal for redress based on the Military Whistleblower Protection Act.
And the redress was what?
So the redress, based on the Military Whistleblower Protection Act, there's a couple of DOD directives that give military members the right to appeal to a member of Congress on any issue without command approval or reprisal. So we use that to craft a campaign. There's also another DOD directive that states that military members can be, as long as they're off base, out of uniform, within the United States, and not speaking disparagingly about the president. That's a gray area there. But you can be at demonstrations, you can do lobbying actions, you can write newsletters. So we began to study these directives to come up with something that was very fine-tuned and something that could cut across different layers of the military culture, whether for moral reasons, practical reasons, burnout, something that people could come into to send a protected communication to a member of Congress. And we launched that campaign in the fall of 2006.
So you knew how to have some legal protections to do the work. Was the work specifically at that point raising questions about U.S. participation in the Iraq and Afghanistan war?
Good question. The appeal statement, which and let me say this, there was some sharp debate around that appeal statement because David Courtwright was pretty adamant that the statement needed to be patriotic because he felt that progressives should not cede the patriotic ground. I agreed with David as a matter of tactic, as a matter of strategy, probably not as a matter of principle. So the statement that I'm paraphrasing, it stated that as a patriotic American, proud to serve my nation in uniform, I call on the United States government to remove all troops from Iraq and from Afghanistan. In fact, we said all troops and all bases. We said that what was taking place, the occupations, will not work, and that it's time for the U.S. It's time for the troops to come home. It was a very basic statement.
It's a very basic statement, but a very radical one. What was the response from the military?
The Pentagon was quick to come out and say that our communication was a protected communication, but they also stated that they were also quick. The PR director for George Bush at that time, whose name slips me, but he came over from Fox News to go over there. He characterized us as a small group of soldiers. He said it's not unusual for soldiers, sailors, and Marines to have some questions about their government. But they characterized us as a very small movement. But they said that we certainly had the right, the legal right, to do what we were doing. And so
what was the response from other soldiers? How did that take off?
It took off to a degree. I mean, if you compare it to the Vietnam era, for example, when 1,300 active duty military took out an open page ad in the New York Times in 1969, then the appeal for redress actually exceeded that. We had over, at the end of our campaign, once it hit its zenith, we had a little over 2,000 soldiers, sailors, and Marines who signed appeals for redress, spanning 10 countries across the globe. Roughly 2/3 of those had done some duty in Iraq. About 60%, 62% exactly came from the Army. Roughly the same number of Marines and Navy personnel. About 10% came from the Air Force. So we got a pretty decent response. I don't think that we were able to get the kind of massive response that I had hoped for, but we definitely drew a lot of attention. I mean, from the likes of every major media network, from New York Times, Washington Post, Nation Magazine, 60 Minutes.
Well, I remember.
Right.
I remember how that blew up. Yeah, and it was a very important. It was a massive and dramatic response from the state and from the corporate media. But as you say, you all launched that work in a much different kind of political environment than what we had back in the early 1970s. I mean, it's a much more conservative environment today. And I want to talk about that a little bit because, with the drumbeat for war that we still see coming from the Trump administration, and from some Democrats who seem to suggest that because of the allegation of Russian involvement in the elections of the U.S., that they seem to be implying that the response should be some kind of confrontation with Russia. We know that the U.S. in essence invaded Syria with the stated intention to occupy a part of that country. And we know, and you saw, and you understand much better than most people, the kind of deterioration that took place in the military with the crazy attempt that they tried to conduct two simultaneous wars, which meant multiple deployments, 6, 7, 8 deployments. Where do you think people are at right now in the military? How do you think people are receiving the possibility of more direct involvement not in Syria, but also expanded involvement in Iraq?
That's a good question.
What do you think, folks, are now that?
What I found in the military was a strong sentiment for the work that we were doing. But people have a very strong economic interest in terms of their service. So their service is not as connected to the ideals or to the imperialist ambitions. It's connected to bread and butter, putting food on the table for my wife, my husband, kids, what have you. Most enlisted military members, once they hit E4, they're married and they're already moving on to the first, some of them even second child. And these are young people getting close to age 25, 26 years old, who are already having a very full plate of
obligations. Brother, I did it at 19.
So you already know. And so when it's time to re-enlist.
Yeah, but by the time I was an E4 and 19 with a wife and 2 kids.
Oh wow, yeah. See, that's the basic. what you just laid out is the basic enlisted culture of the military.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, so, so with that in mind, and the military knows this, and they make it an economic incentive for you to get married. Because
Exactly.
actually, if you don't get married, you're living in poverty. If you get married, they give you what's called base housing allowance,
Right.
which at that enlisted level, that base housing allowance, they call it BAH. That actually exceeds your salary. You know, so they've actually structured it that way to have a reliant base of folks, mostly coming from the marginalized working class urban areas, who continue to re-enlist for their families. And so with that background in mind, that's why for those on the progressive left who push for conscientious objection, but most importantly, the ones that push for counter recruitment, and I support counter recruitment efforts, but because of the economic compulsion in the society and the actual benefits the military puts out, folks are going to join. And so we got to have a two-pronged strategy where
Exactly.
we're organizing the ranks as well.
Yeah.
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 But I think that
You know, Jonathan, we're going to move toward we're going to move toward John. We're going to move toward opening this up for questions from our live stream audience.
okay.
Because the time is always going by so quickly. We know we have people who want to raise some questions with you. So folks, you can begin to send your questions in now. We have a few already. Melina wants to know, since in the military, have you been partnering with other organizations like the Veterans for Peace?
Yes, I am a national member of Veterans for Peace.
Jonathan?
Yes, can you hear me? Okay. Yes, I'm a national
Go ahead, yeah.
member of Veterans for Peace. And the appeal for redress was how I got connected with Veterans for Peace, and also Iraq Veterans Against the War, Military Families Speak Out, the Center for Conscience in War. In fact, J.E. McNeil at the Center for Conscience in War served as our legal advisor back during that time from 2007 to 2009. So I've worked with all the major military peace organizations. I have a relationship with Michael McPherson, who's the executive director of Veterans for Peace. I was at their conference last year doing workshops and what have you. So yes, I have a eternal, long-term relationship with Veterans for Peace, and definitely appreciate the work that they've done on the ground. But at the same time, I think that we have to bring an ethos within that organization that that focuses on organizing within the military. But we also got to bring some younger folks, and to be just straightforward about it, we got to bring some more Black and brown folks to the table, because that organization is aging and it's mostly a Vietnam era organization.
You know, you talked about earlier, you talked about the culture. And, you know, one wonders if, to what extent it really has changed, especially with the change in terms of the gender makeup, whether or not the larger numbers of women involved and has had some kind of impact on the essential culture. And I raise that because the question, she says, what do you feel about the situation with those Marine males who insulted and degraded their fellow female comrades in Facebook with those I've seen pictures. And a continuation of this sort of male-centered culture within the military.
Yes, definitely disgraceful, reprehensible, morally indefensible. When I was in the Navy, when I mentioned that incident with the hangman's noose, and when we took it up to equal opportunity, we actually got a full-blown investigation in our shop. But what came out of that investigation, even though it was racism that sparked it, it was all kind of stuff started coming to the surface. And I never forget this one young lady whose name I won't say, but she came forward with some damaging stuff with these male petty officers who were going around because we were in a Photoshop. They were actually using Photoshop, the actual Photoshop tool on computers, to make fake pictures of her and others. She's one of the few women in our shop performing fellatio and putting the photos throughout the Photoshop, and this came up in investigation. But this type of behavior is very, very prevalent in the military, and quite frankly, the chain of command is complicit in it. So yes, although we have more women in the military today, the culture of the military is definitely still misogynistic. It's very sexist.
Okay.
And the women actually have to buy into the culture to even get promoted, get pushed up the ranks. Yeah.
Wow. So it really hasn't really changed much, even from the time that I was in the military, when we had very few women in the military. Brandon Snyder wants to know, do you believe that the military needs more money? We know that part of the Trump budget is he has proposed to increase the military budget by $54 billion, a 10% increase. Does the military need more money?
I would say no. And the reason why I say no is because when you talk about an increase in the military budget, you're not talking about an increase in the salaries and the basic standard of life of the enlisted women and men in the military. And I focus a lot on the enlisted. You're not talking about that. What you're talking about is the expansion of bases. You're talking about the expansion of programs such as AFRICOM on the continent. And as you mentioned earlier, Ajamu, you're talking about expansion of occupation. So no, the paradigm, the construct, if you will, that Dr. King laid out for us decades ago in his time to break silent speech, in terms of a country that put more money into military defense than programs of social uplift, that military industrial complex, ironically, that Dwight D. Eisenhower laid out, is now gone beyond what anyone's imagination could have been. And so, no, we need to tame that beast if we're going to get some sanity and some humanity in this country.
Well, you know that the Green Party's position is that we need to reduce the military budget by at least 50%. As everyone knows on this show, probably, we're talking about a $640 billion budget, more resources being spent on the military than the next 9 to 12 nations combined. This appears to be complete madness, but yet the Trump administration is calling for, in fact, more money. And when you put that in perspective, that 10% increase of $54 billion is reflective of 80% of the budget of the Russians, who are supposed to be the new enemy now. Their budget is estimated to be around $66 billion. So there's a vast disparity here. And so, but people believe that can be proposed with very little pushback, because one of the consequences of 15 years or more of war is that it appears that the U.S. population has been conditioned to accept war. And that's why we have such a anemic anti-war movement. What can we do? What can we do, Jonathan, to revive an anti-war movement? Do you think that this moment now with the Trump administration, that might pose a new opportunity for us to begin to raise questions about war and peace and to revive an anti-war movement here in this country?
Most definitely, most definitely. But I think what we have to do, it's interesting, Ajamu. My mother will be 70 years young this year. And so when I think about the ethos that I grew up with, the civil rights, the struggle for civil rights, as my mother called it, and the struggle against the Vietnam War, she talked about it hand in hand. The late Julian Bond, and he represented that. The late Kwame Ture represented that. Diane Nash represented that. So yes, but we have to get our movement that's already on the ground, that's fighting against what they term Trump repression, Trump fascism, as they term it, to integrate the anti-war peace ethos within the work that they're already doing. So it's not necessarily us organizing a new anti-war peace movement. It's really getting the movement that's already on the ground to understand they have to broaden the struggle to an anti-war struggle, a struggle for peace, and a struggle against U.S. imperialism and against global imperialism. That's the way to broaden that peace. And to bring historical examples to show that that's the only way that we're gonna build some power to bring some humanity back home here.
Well, it just seems like that's a really, I agree with you, but we have a tall order, because it does appear that there's been a normalization of violence and an acceptance of war as a legitimate instrument of U.S. foreign policy, and there seems to be a bipartisan buy-in to that perspective. It seems that both parties are completely committed to the doctrine of full spectrum dominance, and that's why you see such a timid response from the Democrats. So it seems like the only route that people have in terms of supporting a party that takes a consistent anti-war position is to get behind the Green Party, because we are absolutely clear being opposed to this increase, but also advocating for not only not an increase but a reduction in military spending, and using those resources to enhance the integrity of life here in this country and to really around the world. Because when you have a U.S. military less aggressive and not involved in the kinds of criminal behavior that is involved in right now, then you have less death and destruction throughout the entire world. Jonathan, we've been having the conversation around the possibility of this new developing a new anti-war position. And one of the things that we have talked about was the role of Black folks. You mentioned Dr. King. And I really believe that if we're going to have an anti-war movement, Black folks are going to have to be at the center of it. And so we are moving toward developing a Black Alliance for Peace, which is a anti-war project, anti-war and anti-militarism and anti-repression. We're going to link up the opposition to war abroad with the war being waged on people here in this country. And I think that's very, very important. And we hope that people hear about this and support it. We're going to connect this to the efforts to build a broader anti-war movement. I know you're going to be in Richmond, Virginia, along with myself in June at the United National Anti-War Coalition. We hope that people who are listening to this broadcast consider that. Go online, go to the UNAC website, sign up and join us in Virginia as we try to revive and rebuild an anti-war movement here in this country. I believe that the issue of war is the primary issue. I think there's two issues that we have to take up. Anti-war in terms of internationally, and domestically, we should be in the forefront. That is, talking to the Green Party folks now, we should be in the forefront of the move toward an improved Medicare for all. Those are the two short-term, I think, issues that the Green Party should own. And so, we're going to thank you, my brother, as our time is beginning to come to an end for this show. I think we need a part two of this, because we only scratched the surface, Jonathan. And so I think I definitely want to bring you back so we can delve in even more deeply into the culture of organizing in the military. I want to talk a little bit more about my experiences organizing in the military in a very different era. and talks more about specific U.S. policies in places like on the continent of Africa, and what we see happening in Syria. So, my brother, thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming. How do people get in contact with you and to find out more about your work?
Oh, well, anyone can email me directly, jhutto77 at yahoo.com. I'm also on Facebook at Jonathan Wesley Hutto Sr. You can look me up there. And I organize on the ground here in Prince George's County, Maryland, the Prince George's County People's Coalition. That's our Facebook page. So I'm pretty old school. You can reach me that way. And let's continue to build. Definitely be enrichment at UNAC, no question about it. And we're going to move this agenda forward.
Thank you, my brother. And for folks who are following me, I've been told to remind folks that I am on Twitter. My handle is at Ajamu Baraka. So please come and join me there. And of course, my Facebook page on Facebook. So thanks again, my brother. Appreciate you. Next week, unfortunately, folks, I won't be here because I have a student delegation coming in country. We're going to be on the side of a mountain next Thursday, but I will be back again Thursday after next, right here, a voice from the margins. Good night.